The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Have you heard that phrase before? Anybody? Okay, good. We're here. I was delighted this week when I was thinking about that, generations and what we're going to talk about today, family resemblance. I was thinking about that phrase, and so I was delighted when I typed that phrase, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, into Google. I played a little Google roulette. You know the game, you do it all the time. You're just like, what am I going to come up with? And so I typed that in. I was delighted when I found a website that was dedicated to photo-documented evidence of this phenomenon. So today already, if you've not had your dose of oxytocin, not OxyContin, that's a controlled substance. Oxytocin's free, okay? If you haven't had it yet, you're about to get it. There's gonna be lots of babies and cute animals here. So take a look at this, dad and baby. Yeah, cute, right? What about this one? I love it. Like they look like speed skaters to me. They're like, what? Y'all aren't watching the Olympics, that's how they stand, but it's so cute. I love this one. Take a look. Just like mirror image right there. Or if little kids, babies aren't your thing, just, give me a little aw, like, or what about this? This is a little more ferocious, but still really cute. Look at them, oh my gosh, so cute. Or one more, that's adorable, but my question is, are these pictures proof that babies look like their dads, or is this that dads are really kind of like babies? We'll let the moms answer. I think there might be an answer. And then I got one more final one for you. This is a disco fabulous tree, and it's apple not falling far from it. I don't know what that's all about. Now, Is this proof of the reality that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree? Or is this just confirmation bias? You know confirmation bias, don't you? You already believe something to be true, so you look for data that supports your conclusion. You eliminate all the other data that would speak against it. Is that what this is? Is it just that when we're looking for patterns of likeness in families, we notice the things that are similar, we take pictures of those moments where the baby looks just like his dad or the dad looks just like the baby, whichever one. Is that it? And then we just, delete the other 1,000 pictures in our camera roll. We don't pay attention to that stuff. Is this a real thing that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree? Or is this just confirmation bias? I don't know. Could be either one. But if it's just confirmation bias, then how do you explain this? If you were here with us in the fall, you were here for our series called Broken Heroes. Anyone remember that? It was a long series. Hopefully you remember at least part of it. We started off that series looking at a guy named Abraham, great hero of the faith. Abraham, the father of the Hebrew nation, the Israelite people. Abraham, really a faith father to us all if we are now people who are in Jesus. And so Abraham, he's definitely a hero of the Bible, except Abraham had this problem. When he became afraid, when he became overwhelmed at different moments of life, because he was kind of wandering around in an unsafe region, when he became afraid, he had this bad habit of turning out his wife to neighboring kings, passing her off as his sister to neighboring kings for the return of protection, safety, sometimes even wealth. Not a good thing to do, not a godly kind of behavior. And so we looked at that, and we talked about that when we looked at Abraham in the fall. What we didn't spend time looking at as much was Abraham's son, Isaac. So later on, Abraham and his wife, Sarah, they have a son, Isaac, and Isaac becomes a man, and Isaac gets married, and he's an adult, and strangely, he starts to repeat all of the patterns that his dad laid forth. The good stuff and the bad stuff. Look with me today at Genesis 26. It says, now there was a famine in the land besides the previous famine in Abraham's time. So here it's just calling out that history is repeating itself. Isaac's now a man, and there's a famine, just like there was a famine when his dad was in a similar position in life. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines in Gerar. And again, there was an Abimelech, a different Abimelech in the time of his father Abraham. So the Lord appeared to Isaac and said, hey, I know there's a famine, things are gonna get tough here, it's okay. Do not go down to Egypt. Instead, live in the land where I tell you to live. Egypt, right? Egypt's, that's like, always flourishing in Egypt. That's where you go where there's a famine. God says, no, instead I want you to stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you, and I will bless you here, even in the middle of a famine. For to you and your descendants I will give all of these lands and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and will give them all of these lands, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed. By the way, that's why we're all here, people who are not necessarily people of Hebrew descent, and yet through this nation, we've received the Messiah, and now we are people who are the people of God. We've been blessed, so God fulfilled his promise. That's why we're here today. But God is telling this to Isaac, and I'm gonna do this because Abraham, your dad, obeyed me and did everything required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees, and my instructions. So Isaac listened, and he stayed there in Gerar. Now, when the men of that place asked him about his wife, he said, "She is my sister," because he was afraid to say, "She is my wife." He thought the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah because she's beautiful. Now this, if you weren't here in the fall, this is the exact thing that happened with his dad. God appears to these men. He says, I'm gonna be with you, stay put. I'm gonna bless you, I'm gonna prosper you. I'm gonna raise up offspring for you. Don't worry about anything, I'll take care of you. And then a neighboring king starts looking at their attractive wives and they get panicked and they start to lie. They start to do this whole thing to protect themselves. Same thing happens. When Isaac had been there a long time, though, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked down from a window and he saw Isaac caressing his wife, Rebekah, and he thought, oh, this is not brotherly and sisterly behavior. And so he summoned Isaac and said, surely she's your wife. Why did you say she's my sister? And Isaac answered him, because I thought I might lose my life on account of her. Then Abimelech said, what is this you have done to us? One of our men might have slept with your wife and you would have brought guilt upon us. So Abimelech gave orders to all the people, anyone who harms this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. And then look what God does. In spite of all this, Isaac planted crops in that land in the same year. This is during a famine, mind you. Same year, reaped 100-fold harvest. Why? Because the Lord was there with him. The Lord was blessing him. And the man became rich, and his wealth continued to grow until he was not only rich, he became very wealthy. I don't know the difference, but it sounds nice, right? Rich to very wealthy, it happened there for Isaac on account of God. Now again, if you weren't here with us in the fall, maybe this is lost on you. I'm telling you, if you read the same account of Abraham, or a similar account of Abraham, you'll see it's almost the same thing. A generation later, different people, slightly different locations, different players, the exact same stories. Why? Now, for ages, spiritual people have observed these patterns in the scripture, but also in the world around us. And that has led people in the church to spend time speculating about things called generational sin. Are there certain sins that just kind of get passed down, specific sins, beyond just our general sinfulness that gets passed down from generation to generation? Or are there generational curses? Can you do something that then kind of haunts or follows your family, brings punishment on your family, some weird kind of spooky voodoo stuff? Are there demonic oppressions that can follow people from generation to generation? We start to wonder because we see these patterns and we don't have a good explanation for it. And if it's not a matter of generational sin or generational curses, then how do we make sense of these long observed generational patterns? I mean, this is not the stuff of How I Met Your Mother, right? This is not, hey kids, let me tell you about how I met your mom and the day that I passed her off to a foreign king. This is not the stuff that you tell your kids. These are family secrets that you keep hidden. And yet, for Isaac not knowing any of this stuff about his dad, he does the exact same thing that his dad did. How does that happen? Or more specifically, how does it happen in your family? Because you know it happens. Doesn't it feel sometimes like we come pre-programmed, pre-loaded with all kinds of baggage when we come into the world, stuff that we don't even know about, we start repeating things? How does that happen? I mean, I wonder about this. I wonder why it is on the Garrett side of the family, my dad's side of the family, I'm one of 16 first cousins, which I thought was a lot until I heard that AJ is one of 16 siblings. I was like, that was a lot of cousins, that's a lot of siblings. One of 16 first cousins on my dad's side of the family. 9 of them, I believe, of us are male. And already 2 of my first cousins, younger than me, have died from drug overdoses. And there are several others who are on their way who I'm sure that's how they're gonna die in their life. And they're not from the same parents. These are different households. These are from different aunts and uncles. And I look at this pattern of addiction to the point of death, overdose. And I look at that and I say, how does that happen? Is that because my grandpa was an alcoholic and he passed on a gene of addiction to our family? Maybe. Then why am I spared from that? Why have I not gone down that similar road? I didn't have the perfect upbringing, so why haven't I done that? What about my other cousins? What makes the difference in some stories versus others? Or what about other patterns in my family that I've observed? Patterns of violence, patterns of divorce. I don't think anyone has found a divorce gene yet. But what do we make of those things? Or why is it that kids who've been switched at birth often not only physically maintain likeness of their genetic family, but even mannerisms? There was a podcast I heard years ago about these girls in a small Wisconsin town. Sue McDonald and Marty Miller were their names. The McDonald and Miller family in the small town, very different families. They were switched at birth. The doctor made a mistake. He realized he made a mistake and didn't want to, hurt his reputation, so he never told anybody. And the whole town just kind of was like, went along with it. But everyone wondered because these girls not only didn't look like their family of origin, they acted like they belonged to the other family, even though they didn't really know each other. And later on in life, someone finally put it together and took a DNA test and they figured it out. How does that happen? That kids born of one family switch to another family, behave like they're still a part of another family, a family they've never ever belonged to. Why does that happen? Or for me, I wonder all the time, why is it that all the women in Jocelyn's family, why is it that when they stand at rest, they stand like this? And sometimes like this. And they all do it. We'll be at like Thanksgiving and you'll look and they're all just like standing like this. And there are times where our girls, when they were toddlers, they'd be standing there like this. And we're just like, where does this come from? Is that in your genes? Like, how do you, what? Like, why? Where does this stuff come from? And see, up until recently, it's been like spiritual people, thoughtful people observing and wondering and trying to come up with reasons and looking at Bible verses and just saying like, why does this stuff happen? And there's been these battles about nature and nurture, and science is beginning to understand a little bit more about how this whole thing works, how generations affect each other. We see a lot of it around trauma research these days. Trauma, a lot has been talked about recently with trauma, and for some of us, we think of trauma as like the really big stuff, PTSD stuff, surviving a war or something really, an awful event that's, cataclysmic. But what we're realizing is that trauma, in a more narrow or broader, I guess, definition, is simply experiencing something difficult, so difficult that it overwhelmed the resources you had at the time to manage it. And so for some of us, we can encounter identical events, but depending on the age, depending on our maturity, depending on our support system, the resources that we have to manage that difficult event, for some of us, we may bounce back and we may, okay, that was hard, but I moved on. For some of us, it may have a deep effect because the difficulty of the event overwhelmed the resources that we had at the time. And what we're finding is trauma is not just kind of like a flaky mental concept. Trauma actually ends up being manifested in our bodies. That there are physical illnesses, there are physical problems that we carry for the rest of our lives because of unresolved trauma. But it's not just that. What we're discovering is that there's a thing called generational trauma. That someone, 3 rungs up the family ladder or the family tree can experience something really hard, and that trauma in their body can actually be passed down to their kids and their grandkids. So you can be born with different things in your body, different health issues, different anxiety issues that are real, that are a result of something that happened generations ago. And again, this has been a pattern that people have wondered about. Is this real or is this not? Finally, science is explaining it through something called epigenetics. Heard about epigenetics? Yeah, genetics is simply the study of our genes, what's in our genes, mapping our DNA and seeing what's in there, what's in our map. Epigenetics is kind of this new field of science that wrestles with why it is that certain things that happen to us, experiences we live through, things in our environment, how and why they affect the way our genes manifest. And this is what epigenetics realizes, is that yes, I have a genetic code, but the experiences I have, the environment I live in, what I live through is going to impact how those genes manifest in my life. Not only will they manifest how they impact how those genes manifest in my life, but they may impact then how those genes, which genes are passed on in a dominant way to my kids and my grandkids. And suddenly, through the study of epigenetics, we have this sense of, oh my gosh, generational trauma. Something that happened to my grandmother can still be affecting me. For instance, I've got a mild condition called tachycardia. You know what that is? Anyone know tachycardia? Yeah, it just means I have a high heart rate. And the only reason I found out about it is I got my first heart rate monitor years ago, and I was working out. I was working out with someone else who had a heart rate monitor, and it's like, yeah, I'm sweating. And they're like, yeah, me too. And I'm like, yeah, my heart rate's 180. And they were like, are you okay? And I'm like, I feel fine. And then later I looked and I was like, yeah, it's 200 now. What's yours? And they're like, I think you need to stop and we need to call an ambulance. And I'm like, no, I'm okay. And then come to find out, I've got a high heart rate. I also have autoimmune issues. I'm allergic to a lot of things. Got some other issues with that. And what I've discovered over the years is, kind of through this, is I'm like, I have tachycardia. Oh, my mom does too. I didn't know that. And my mom has all kinds of autoimmune issues too. I didn't know that. My sisters don't have those same issues. I'm one of 3 kids. My sisters kind of have been spared from it. It's me and my mom. We have a lot of the same issues. Now, that could be that there's something genetic that we share, just kind of hardwired in our genes. It could be that my mom and I lived through some similar trauma, and in fact, we did. When she was pregnant with me, there was some hard stuff. It was a hard time in her life. My first year of life was kind of a hard time in our lives, our family's life. And so it could be that common trauma affected us in a similar way. Or it could have been not just hardwired gene stuff, it could have been something that happened up the family tree where some ancestor experienced a trauma that had been passed on, and we are the recipients of that. See, epigenetics is a study of how these things interact and interrelate. My point in saying this, and I'm not doing it justice, my point in saying this is that these patterns that we observe are not a figment of our imagination. Really, what happened generations ago can manifest in our bodies physically. Not only in our bodies, though, we know this, that these things can manifest in our minds as well. Family scripts and narratives and stories and core beliefs get passed on from generation to generation, and they get imprinted in our brain. And we talk about this. We talk about the power of words to create reality. And we know that that's true. And what we're also learning about the brain is that the brain is not a singular brain. It's a brain really of at least 3 core parts. It's a tripart brain or a triune brain. Often when we think about our brain, we're thinking about our executive functions of our brain. This is the stuff that we're doing right now. I'm talking to you in logical ways, and we're learning, and this is our prefrontal lobes, and that's what we think of our brain and our scripts that run. But we also have a limbic system, a deeper part of our brain. We have a brainstem, a survival system deep in our brain. And here's what we're learning about our brains. That all 3 parts of these brains can be running different scripts. It's not just our prefrontal lobe. That all 3 of these parts of our brains run scripts, and sometimes those scripts are in conflict. For instance, I've come to realize that my kids share a common view of life often. And the view is that if something good happens today, I'm probably gonna have to pay for it tomorrow. Anyone kind of feel that way? If I have a really good day, I'm kind of bracing myself for tomorrow to be a really bad day. Anyone kind of believe that? Yeah, my kids think that, and I'm like, why do you think that? You have a good life, like you haven't lived through a whole bunch of bad stuff. Why do you think that? And it's finally dawned on me, The reason they think that's true, it's because I believe that's true. I live with that sense that if something good happens to me, I'm gonna have to pay for it later in some other way. Now, theologically, rationally, I know that's not true. See, this is not who God is. He's not a God who said, well, I parcel out a good thing for you here today, and now you're kind of gonna be without good things for a really long time. That's not who God is. God is a God of abundance. He wants to put all kinds of good things into your life. You can expect him to keep pouring out goodness on you. I know that to be true. Theologically, I know that to be true. But there's something in some other part of my brain, some other script that's running that says, every time something good happens, that says, uh-oh, look out. The scales have to be balanced somehow. This is too good. You're gonna have to pay for this later. And those things run in my mind in conflict. Not only do they run in my mind in conflict, somehow, and there's probably reasons for that for me, and I won't tell you about all those, but some things that happened to me growing up and the way, like there's maybe some reasons that my brain functions that way. What makes no sense to me is that my kids' brains function that way. They did not experience the things I experienced growing up. They've lived through a pretty stable life where they have seen the goodness of God. I don't understand why they have this same sense that I do, that if something good happens to me today, I'm gonna have to pay for it tomorrow. And yet somehow it's in there, and they're fighting those scripts too. See, again, not to go too deep into this, and you can do your own research on this, and it's fascinating to discover how complex, how fearfully and wonderfully we have been made, and also to see science come to grips with things that we as people of faith have observed and wondered about for a long time. But here's just what I want to say. It is not crazy to see these generational patterns as real. It is not confirmation bias. It's science. And not only are these things real, but they're at work in your life right now. See, none of us are blank slates. We do not come into the world blank slates, ready to be filled up. We come into this world pre-loaded in our bodies, in our minds. It's true. And again, people of faith have been talking about this for a long time because we have this concept that we call original sin. And we say we're born into this world and there's something pre-loaded in us that is against God, that is turned inward. And science is finally saying, yeah, that's true in a lot of different ways. See, none of us are blank slates. And unless you learn to untangle, to uncover, to recognize these root patterns, to understand these things, here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna end up reliving these things over and over and over again. Not only will you be reliving these things, but if you have kids someday, they might have to relive these things. Grandkids someday may have to relive these things. You cannot live a whole life, which is what we believe God has got for all of us here at Pathfinder, until you learn from these patterns, until you change them. Now, to help you do this, and I'm gonna talk more about this next week, I think. Not to next week yet, but I think we're gonna talk more about this next week. I'm gonna give you a preview of it right now. To help you uncover some of these patterns, because this is important stuff, I wanna show you this tool called a genogram or a genogram. It is a family tree on steroids. So you do a family tree and you kind of say, who came from whom, and Ancestry or those other sites might help you do this. But a genogram helps you not just look at your family tree, but it helps you look at the other patterns that are passed down in your family tree. You may look at relational dynamics of closeness or disconnection, and you may observe a pattern. Like for instance, those people we were looking at earlier, Abraham and his wife Rebecca, and then Isaac and his wife Rebecca, and Abraham and Sarah, and then later on, their sons, Jacob and Esau. Like there's three generations, and what we've seen in these families is there's kind of this weird relationship sometimes between mothers and one son. The moms play favorite, they pick a chosen son, they pit that son against the father. There's this dynamic that happens in these families over and over and over again. So genogram, you might notice like, oh, in these relationships, these people tended to be close, these people did not. You'll notice patterns of divorce, remarriage. You'll notice patterns of abandonment. You'll notice patterns of sometimes even fertility or miscarriage. You'll notice patterns of different health issues or mental health issues. You'll notice different vocational patterns. And I had to do this in seminary, and I was not excited about it because I was like, this is overwhelming. And this means you have to really start to dig into your family tree in ways that make you and other people uncomfortable. But it was powerful when I started to do this to realize that things that I thought were just a function of the household I grew up in, and at the time I was newly married, and the household that I was creating, I thought those things were unique to me, but they weren't. Many of them were fruits of things that had happened generations before in my life. Again, you are not a blank slate. You are the product of everything that came before. But that doesn't mean you're a victim. And I want to be clear on this, that the result of all of this shouldn't be to blame and be frustrated with the people up here. I'll just tell you really personally in my life, I'm doing a lot of this work. I should have done more of it back when I was in seminary when my professor made me do this. But there comes a point in your life, and often for people it's in your late 30s or in your 40s, where you start to feel strangled by some of the patterns, and you just go, I can't do life this way anymore. And you look to change it, and you look to understand it, and kind of untangle the mess of life. And I'm in a season where I'm doing that right now, honestly, where I'm trying to figure things out, and I'm trying to break old patterns, and I'm trying to make new patterns. And it can be easy to become blaming and frustrated with those who have come before, except for this. Mercifully, I'm also at a place in my life where I'm raising kids who are transitioning into adulthood. And I'm watching, and I've been a very dedicated parent. Jocelyn and I, being good parents has been the focus of our lives. I think we've done a pretty good job, but I'm watching with this vulnerability that parents feel when your kids are getting to this age, realizing that although I've been a very dedicated parent and I've tried my best, there is 100% chance that I've messed my kids up in some way. You know what I'm talking about? You're like, there's no way I did this perfectly. I tried to be perfect. There's no way I've done it perfectly. And someday in their 30s or 40s, my kids are gonna be doing this similar exercise. They're gonna be looking and they're gonna be like, man, Dad really messed us up. I know that's gonna be true. I know for certain that's going to be true. And maybe that's a good thing, because otherwise life would be boring. We'd have nothing to do in our middle age time other than, right? Like, it's good that our parents mess us up because we've got something to do now. It keeps us busy. It's better than playing Wordle, right? The goal of this is not to blame those who came before. I think as you start to do this work, and again, we'll talk about this more next week, be kind to those who came before you. Chances are they were doing the best they could with the resources they had at the time. And if we all can do just a little bit better, that's some huge victory. And at the same time, get serious about doing some of this work, understanding the patterns that have been passed down to you, because you are not a blank slate. Get serious about understanding those things so that you can begin to reshape your path. Not just your path, but the path of those who come after you. Now here's the reality in all of this. This work is overwhelming and it's heavy. And also much of what I've just said for the last 10 minutes or so, you probably could read in psychology books, you could read in self-help books. And yet here's what makes us different as the people of God. All of the things that I've said are true, but this is what often is going to be left off of mental health books or self-help books that are trying to help you do this kind of thing. That what we have access to, in addition to all of this science and all of these resources, what we have access to is a God who very early on in human history reveals himself to be a healer of generations. See, very early on, we were looking at Genesis before, in the book of Exodus, God takes a moment and he reveals himself to a man named Moses. You've probably heard of Moses, great leader of the people. And Moses had been leading the people for a while, the people of Israel, and he had been doing so kind of from a place of ignorance. Like, he knew who the God of Israel was. He had seen him do some amazing things, knew he was powerful, knew he was like no joke. But Moses gets to this point where he's like, God, I need to see more of you. I need to understand who you really are, because I don't know enough about who you are in order to lead your people. I don't feel like I've got a big enough picture. And so Moses prays this prayer. He says, God, show me your glory. I want to see you. I want to see more of you. I want to know you better. And I'll just tell you that I think that's where a lot of us probably sit today also, right? You know there's a God, you've heard about God, you've seen some of God's goodness, but you feel like the picture is still fuzzy. If that's you today, I'm gonna encourage you to pray the same prayer that Moses did. God, show me your glory. Help me see you as you really are. And then I'm gonna encourage you to keep coming here to Pathfinder, because that's what we're about here. We're about helping you come to know God as he really is, not all the ways that people have made him out to be. We're talking about the real God here. When Moses prayed this prayer, God obliged him. And I'm not going to show you the whole encounter, but I want to show you this moment where very early on in human history, God said something important about himself to Moses and to all of us. It says, then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with Moses, and he proclaimed his name. In other words, he described himself. He helped himself be known to Moses. And his name, it's written in all caps here, the Lord. The name here in Hebrew is actually Yahweh. Yahweh is the personal name of God. So you know how in like Greek mythology, the gods all have specific names? We just kind of call God, God. But in the Old Testament, he actually gave himself a name. He said, I want you to know me by this name. My name is Yahweh. And we've messed it up and thought it was Jehovah for a while, and that was a linguistic mistake. It's Yahweh. And so Moses is like, Yahweh, tell me who you really are. Help me understand who you really are. And so God comes down and he says, this is what it means that I'm Yahweh. This is what you can count on from me. And he passed in front of Moses, and this is what he proclaimed. This is what he said. Yahweh, Yahweh, this is who I am. The compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands of generations. Now, some translations leave this out, but it's definitely the force of the text. Maintaining love to thousands of generations and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet, he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generation. So again, just a snapshot here. God's revealing himself to Moses very early on in human history, and he's saying, this is who I am. Now the question for you today is, when you hear God revealing himself here, what do you notice? Chances are what a lot of us notice is this part right here. He's a God who punishes the children for the sins of their parents to the third and fourth generation. He's the God who curses people, like Doug Moss said last week. He's the God who allows parents to eat sour grapes and their kids' teeth to be set on edge, which was the complaint of the Israelites at one point in their history. See, a lot of us look at this and we say, God, that's so unfair that you allow kids and grandkids to suffer for the sins of their parents. But if that's what you notice, if that's what you're seeing, you're noticing the wrong thing. See, what I actually hear God saying here as he reveals himself is he's a God who sets boundaries around the damage that we can do to our kids, to our grandkids. At our most wicked, God says, he's gonna let that play out for about 3 or 4 generations. And if you look at human history, you'll see this pattern of families kind of every 3 or 4 generations kind of having a turnover. It's a new day. God says, I'm gonna limit the evil, the brokenness. I'm not gonna let it go on forever. I'm gonna give it 3 or 4 generations max. That'll be the extent of the natural consequences. Some of those things need to play out. But here's what you can count on, God says. Here's what you can count on with me. Although I may allow that stuff to play out for 3 or 4 generations, you can count on my love and faithfulness, that I'm slow to anger, abounding in love, that I am gracious and compassionate, and you can count on me being that way, not for 3 or 4 generations, but 1,000 generations. You see what God is saying? He's saying, this work is hard, it is messy. He designed us to pass blessing on from generation to generation. Sin got in the way, it messed it all up. Now we pass brokenness on from generation to generation. But God is saying, in my mercy, I will limit the impact of your sin on those who come after you. And more than that, in every generation, here's what you can count on: I will overwhelm you with my goodness. You are not alone. in trying to break patterns. You are not alone in dealing with the effects of sin and brokenness for generations. I'm gonna be with you and you can count on my goodness. Jesus said it even more clearly in John 15. As Jesus stood on the earth, the real glory of God manifest, fully revealing who God is. Here's what he said. This is who God is. Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine, and neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. And then he brings it all together and he says this. He says, I am the vine, and you have all been invited to be branches. I've made you branches. I've brought you into me. It's not a family tree. It's Jesus. He's the trunk. He's running down it. He is the vine, and we have all been grafted in. And he says this, if you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing. Hear what Jesus is saying. He's saying that whatever family tree you come from, whatever your family of origin looks like, as you do the work, as you uncover these patterns, no matter how scary that is, Jesus has made you a part of a new family. He's the vine, and he has grafted all of us in by faith. If we profess the name of Jesus as our Savior, as Lord, as we've done in singing today, if we believe that to be true, then we have been brought into a new family. And whatever your family of origin looks like, this is what Jesus has done. He's brought you into a new bloodline, and he's writing new family stories for you. He's teaching you new patterns, new ways of living. Things like we do today, praying and worshiping together and all the things that we do, but other patterns too, learning how to love your enemies, learning how to pray for those who persecute you, learning how to forgive people even when they've wronged you in significant ways. Jesus he's teaching that. He's putting in you a new power that will enable you to heal. He's putting in you new life. Right now, in this moment, you are being remade, you are being renewed, you are being reborn. You've been brought into a new royal lineage. And by his Spirit, he is ingraining new patterns in your body, in your mind, in every part of your being. You are not alone in this work. No matter what you find from your family tree, Jesus has brought you into a new family, and he is doing something new in you today. And I don't know if you need to hear this today, but I need to hear this today. I need to be reminded that my human family does not have the final word over me. It's real, and I got to deal with that for the good of my kids and those who come after me. But at the end of the day, Jesus has done something better, and he is at work in me. And he is doing something new in me. And the only thing I have to do in order for that work to be complete is I simply remain. I stay put. And I let him have his way. See, untangling all this generational stuff, it requires work from a human standpoint. But being a part of Jesus' family, this new spiritual work, it requires nothing other than simply remaining in Jesus. So do the work, but starting new, beginning new, it all begins with remaining in Jesus. Let me pray for that. God in heaven, thank you for so early on in your self-revelation, for being clear about who you are. That you're not a punishing, angry God. That you're a God of love. Your anger may last a moment, your love lasts a lifetime. And God, thank you for the promise that even when we are at our worst in our families, you've created boundaries around that, you've set limits to that. You won't let it go on forever. And Lord, even more than that, thank you for the promise today that you're doing something new in us right now. Lord, I want to pray over anyone today who is just feeling heavy, weighed down by all of the entanglements of broken family patterns, of sin, of stuff that was done generations ago, stuff that exists right now in our own lives, God, whatever that is. I pray that right now you'd press in on us with your grace, your goodness. God, speak over us that you're here, that you love us, you're with us, you're for us, you'll bless us. God, help us believe if we're feeling hopeless, if we're feeling stuck, if we're just feeling awash in shame. God, I pray that today you would help us believe that right now you're doing something new. God, help us know that we're not alone. God, help us feel some of the life and the mercy of Jesus, the vine coursing through us. God, begin in us new patterns. Help us just to sense the beginning of something new, the healing that you promise to bring to us all, to every generation. God, I pray that that would be real for us today, and that we would leave this place being so grateful that we're yours, being again people of hope, people of life, people who believe that wholeness is possible. God, give that to us, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, thank you so much for hanging out with us today. I'm so glad you could join us, and hopefully you were enriched by what you saw and heard just now. If you want to learn more about our church, about Pathfinder, you can check us out at pathfinderstl.org. Additionally, too, if you'd like to refresh yourself on the message from today, check out our message podcast. One last thing you can do for us is to like, share, comment, subscribe, do all the above. Help us reach even more people with the important message of Jesus Christ. Finally, a blessing on your week. Thanks so much for joining us.